Thanks, Andy, and thanks to Courtney and Anjalie. I'm not so sure that I'm leading so much as following, and following with a wow. That was just incredible, I think, in terms of the two directions from which a different account and analysis of modernism has been brought to us this afternoon. First, I think Courtney, I'll just say in brief, because I've got more time to have comments this afternoon, but just in brief, I felt that the two papers brought what I call macrological and micrological approaches. So macrological, and what I mean by that, is a broad analysis of the terms by which we are invited to understand modernism, modernity, and the modern. And I thought the way in which you situated particular artistic practices in relation to those terms, not through those terms, but in relation to them, was really quite masterful. Because what it does is it opens something up between the terms and the practices, and in the gap between the terms and the practice, other work starts to be done. So it invites us to really rethink how we're thinking these materials. And actually, similarly, Anjalie, from a micrological way, and what I mean by micrology is by looking at the thing right in the very detail, getting under the skin of the exhibition, and not looking at what it claimed to do, but what it actually did through its effects. And the way you did that was not through an analysis of terms, but by an analysis of the exhibitionary forms and what its effects were, and how it situated the practices in relation to those forms, in relation to the exhibitionary texts, and in relation to the way in which the exhibition placed those objects and those materials. So similar work being done, I think, or parallel works being done between you. I think underneath it all, though, for me, as I was listening to you, was an insistence, I think, that modernism is always and already transnational, and that we can't refuse that. And in some way, I think it then brings me back to the initial question that we were left with by Isaac, which he just threw into the room and left us with his work. When he asked, is Black British modernism a bit of a red herring? If modernism is always and already transnational, is this emphasis on the Black British a red herring?
David, thank you for that further provocative question. Do you guys want to respond now? Or
I think Anjalie does.
Okay, Angela, I think...
I don't know.
What
do you think he means?
Do you want me to open it up a bit?
Yeah.
Just in terms of... I think the thing about the Britishness question, because I think you both are saying, and this is where the question is, in a way, you both are saying that modernism has to be taken as transnational. Why we wouldn't want to do anything else? The question then is Britishness always and already a transnational term in itself? And does it make sense to try and close Britishness down and say that Britishness is a limited set of practices? Or does Britishness already imply a certain kind of transnationalism?
Yeah.
I mean, that's really where...
It does for me, but I don't know that it does for all people. Just in our current post-Brexit moment, I think Britishness doesn't necessarily mean something transnational to everybody. Perhaps in this room it definitely implies something transnational, but I don't know.
Courtney, Britishness?
I know a lot about it. I guess I take the yes, but it's a problematic issue, right? So Britishness is transnational. Let's ask the Scots, let's ask the Welsh. Let's go to Cornwall and ask. In some ways, that sense of what is transnational, I think we have to question. It's not necessarily a positive thing to be not everyone wants what transnationalism means, but we do live with it, right? So yes, to be British and to think through the sort of British project is absolutely transnational, because otherwise you'd get to be English, right? So if we want to say that, sure, but we also have to take the baggage on with it as well. So when you say British, you realize you're saying the uncomfortability of the Welsh, the uncomfortability of the Irish. You know, let's take all of that with us. But I think, you know, in some ways I'm answering that as if, you know, I know history and I don't. You know, much like Tanya Barson, I fall back on art history when I answer almost anything. And I think that this question of what we do with it in art history, I think, is a very different one. Because, you know, as Karina, I think, told us last night, you know, there's, you know, the British after the war were definitely not considered modern by anybody. So, you know, Henry Moore's fight to be modern happens in 47 on the doorstep of MoMA, when MoMA decides that he gets to be modern, largely because they don't want to reify, you know, the young painters, the ABAX people in their midst. So, you know, the sort of quest towards modernness is often something that happens on the back of somebody else as well.
And there are, notable contradictions at so many different levels. It makes me think of two things come up in my mind straight away. One is there's a moment that some will know when Alfred Barr comes to London in 1928, and he comes here to the Tate, and he sees quite a lot of modern pictures on the walls. And he sees those Impressionist and some post-Impressionist pictures, and he goes back and he says, it's fantastic, they've got this thing in London about having a national gallery and having this other place called the Tate with modern art. And what he failed to take in, why would anybody have pointed it out, is that he was looking at the paintings that belonged to Samuel Courtauld. They were simply on loan here. They didn't belong to the Tate at all. And he completely misread what he could see in 1928. The other thing one can't not say is remembering that there was a moment on this stage when Stuart Hall was sitting here amidst many discussions in which he took part, and I remember him at that point saying, well, it's taken me a long time to think about being British, but I cannot think about being English. Let's just open up to who, I'm sure there's lots of contributions, and actually I was seeing first.
I wanted to just jump on to David's question about looking at Britishness as a frame, understanding what is the problem, the contradictions about that, and just go back to Courtney, your last statement, which was fantastic, really enigmatic and kind of, I wrote it down. I think you said modernism is only a problem, or something like this, when seen within the frame of the modern. Very cool. So I guess I'm looking at the limitations posed by looking at modernism and Britishness. But you're implying in that there's also a problem about looking at it through the frame of the modern. If modernism, if you look back at modernism through the rearview mirror, through the frame of a modern, there is a problem. I wonder maybe if you could just kind of open that up a little bit, because that obviously has, as I think you were kind of implying, implications for the BAM, what we're trying to do within the BAM project, which is thinking about how do we look at the model. If you get my drift, if I'm making any sense.
No, you are. I just don't know that I'm equipped to answer it.
Okay.
If the question here is that at any point when you're looking at something, I mean, let's take the words out, because we're going to say the same words over and over, right? So if you're looking at something, but you do so either consciously or unconsciously through that thing itself. So, you know, I look at everything through who I am, then you're always going to be inside of it, and there's never any way to get out of it. I mean, that's essentially, I think, what you're asking. How do you do that? To know.
Just thank you both for those papers. I think, Courtney, you said something really interesting about the market. And then when I heard Anjalie speak, she talked about the museum. I want to ask you both, is there a difficult relationship between the museum and the market being worked out?
Either of you aware of market museum questions that came into your mind?
What does it mean in both places?
I feel that I don't understand the art market in any way.
Right. But do the people who put shows and museums together understand what modernism means in that context?
Can I ask curators in the room that question?
I'm sure there are some who can come in on this. Courtney, do you want to come in?
You know what? I think the market is fascinating, actually. And I decided at some point that I wanted to look at the market in the way that one looks at any other market, and to recognize it as a market, right? As opposed to thinking of it as this odd thing that sort of floats around what, as an art historian, I know, right? And in fact, so much of what is built as periodization into our field is in the time of its making was market-driven success, right? So in some ways, I think that if we don't, as art historians, have a better sense of the market, we don't have a better sense of what we're doing. And I think this is where we made a mistake, because our field used to be so clearly driven by connoisseurship, by taste, by the sort of kind of a technical sense of provenance research. And then we got bored with that because we thought that it was too tedious, right? But there was a point to that, because all of that told you how we got to the space where something became history. So we do need to know about the market. Does the market drive, what happens, what we see in institutions that are not actually, buying and selling directly? Of course it does. The market drives everything. I mean, it's like saying that it's like calling Cuba a problem and buying toothpaste in America. You're still feeding the beast, I guess. So I think that maybe, as opposed to being so critical and so sort of, I think art historians and curators can be quite derogatory towards the market until we need it, or we need something from it. Maybe we should just understand it better and see it as just another system, maybe.
I mean, to make a very obvious point, every one of the works that Anjalie talked about through that exhibition, the curators will have known the indemnity values. In other words, each one will have had a kind of technical position because of how it was brought into Tate, and it will have been listed and known. Those indemnity values don't get published, but they're there, and they're absolutely, at any moment, a reflection of exactly how the market is redetermining at any point comparative values of one kind.
I'm just wondering about the difference between the British experience and the American in terms of the market, because obviously the market does drive everything on one level, but I think the kind of post-Second World War kind of introduction of public funding was trying to do something different as well, which also allowed, the funding structures allowed all sorts of practices to proliferate through institutions, one of which is, of course, the vehicle with which Isaac Julian, made films, for example, famously. But I wondered whether, and I can see more and more the kind of incursion of the market into the publicly funded institution now, of course, with withdrawal funding. So there is a slight difference. I'm not sure how much difference that makes or not. I wondered whether anyone on the panel had a view about that.
I'm a scholar of British art, technically. That's what my title is. So in fact, I know more about what happens here than I do there sometimes. And I'm not saying that just to put myself off the hook, but I do think that maybe we draw that parallel very easily, but I think maybe we sometimes need to open up a bit and think through what's happening in lots of countries. America isn't really just the only way to think this. The shift in '89 financially happens here, around the market that is established here, which brings us, to the full-blown freeze week at this point. That happens in '89 here, not elsewhere. Yeah.
I think I'm just trying to go through some of the path of the discussions at the moment, and just how we got to this question of the market. I'm just trying to think about how I guess some of these terms we talk about Britain, we talked about the United States, and in a way, is that notion of Britain operating as a red herring as the notion of the United States operating as much of a red herring? I'm wondering whether we can think about these questions in relation to if you like, the way that those terms are actually built and how we make them work. And I'm thinking about that in relation to the question about collage that was brought up yesterday, and whether the ideas, the way that we build an idea through the use of this effect of collage could be quite useful here. I've just noted that in your presentation, the moment of the cut and flip. And I thought, cut and flip, and then yesterday we had the cut and mix. I'm wondering if these are kind of ways in which we can think about how to think about any of these ideas. So Britain, as we think about it, we, in a sense, rethink rethink or reimagine what it is and what modernism might mean at any point. And it's a cut and a mix, or it's a cut and a flip. But someone also was saying, well, that isn't just an easy term, there's something going on there. And within that, there's a lot of, there's certain kinds of violence, things which are lost. And you saw that in relation to Isaac Julian's film, in the sense of things which are lost and points of memory which are things which are lost and foreclosed upon, and then kind of brought back together again. They're cut out and they're remixed, or they're cut out and they're reflipped. And to me, although there's a kind of great sense of loss and sadness there, there's also something quite affirmative, because there is something in saying, well, it's actually critical. Gestures are kind of a moment of real strong, critical, affirmative power, where you're actually able to say, well, this moment of modernism, whatever it means now, is something that we can affirm in terms of any of the materials that we want to bring together. We are the ones who state what will be central and what will be peripheral. We are the ones which say what will be lost and what will be recuperated. And I think that that's the work that I think we're being invited to do across many of the conversations that I've been hearing over the past few days, is to be affirmative in terms of saying we are the ones who state what those conditions are. And then I think the next step is then just to give an account of that and take up some kind of responsibility in saying, I'm the one who's doing the cut and the flip. I've cut this and I've flipped this round. It's me.
So
and on
to
what
go
terms am I
back
doing
to
that?
what Sonia mentioned at the start this morning. So just going back to what Sonia was saying this morning around how do we come to know the work, how do we forget it, and then how do we come to re-know the work?
I mean, Angie, I think all of us were delighted by your pair of scissors, in the sense that I think we all felt you should have been given a go to rehang that show and probably re-curate it. But let me just...
It's easier to critique a show than it is to make
well,
one.
Well, sure, but I think that the kind of the kind of detailed examination is what I think all of us think really matters. I mean, I was thinking of Cobner, Mercer's term last night, when Cobner was being asked about the kind of range of influences from artists, from black artists particularly, and he uses, I thought, tremendous word about entanglement, about what is that, because entanglement seemed to me to be both a word of the complexity of what we're looking at, but also the sense of the kind of creative openness. But what it makes me aware of, and both of you, I think, in your papers have shown elements of this, is trying to look at disentanglement in recognising entanglement. How do we pick some of this apart, whether it's in the institutional practices, whether it's in matters of understanding and influence and engagement. So it seems to me that it may feel that it's easier, but we should still give you the chance to go and make the exhibition again. Courtney, how do you feel about the questions of entanglement?
Well, I feel entangled because I contributed to the Afro-Modern catalogue. So I feel entangled. I'm not sure. I think that is where I find where, Bowling and Irene, I was going to say Frank and Rashid, but where they sit for me in some ways is that kind of space, because they are and were both so very caught up into exactly what they were very critical of, and yet they could, they both agitated in very different ways, and then could step back and notice that and point to, this is the problem, and yet they still had to live in it. And so I think that, entanglement actually really is a good term to think that through, because because you see it and you recognize it, and you even know its parameters, you can't get out of it necessarily.
It's there. Let me see, there's a couple more comments we should take. Someone just here and then someone at the back. Yes, let's go here first.
I have a question for Anjalie. Anjalie, it's to do with, I suppose, the history of Afro-modern and what you seem to be identifying as a kind of, not too harsh about it, sort of pathology in the way that Tate and other museums by implication construct and constitute questions of modernism and also identity in their shows. And I'm just wondering if you have any, not a magic bullet, but I mean, any hope of any genuine transformation. And the reason why I'd say that is that, you know, you mentioned about how we had an Afro-modern sort of segregationist impulse in the way that the show had been perhaps conceived of and was displayed. But we seem to see this repeating itself in the institution again and again. For example, you talked very eloquently today, Courtney, about Rashid Areen's work. And we know that we recently had an exhibition here about conceptualism, as you mentioned, Rashid's, and other significant African and Asian heritage artists working in Britain were excluded from that, including, for example, David Mandela. And then we know that an exhibition is coming up in the new year about, I suppose, artists and sexuality, looking at queer art or gay art, and I can almost, I'd be very interested to see whether artists such as Ajamu or Julian will be included in that. And so I'm just wondering, is there any end in sight? This continuous sort of practice. And, you know, despite all of the initiatives which seem to be made around, is that a speech, not a question? Despite all the initiatives which seem to be made around curatorship and, you know, art history, we still seem to be, you know, stuck in a kind of cycle. Not to say that there isn't progress, but it seems to be inordinately slow. I just wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
So the question is, are you just asking for some reflections on other curatorial projects?
How you think things are developing. I mean, you know, Afro-modern is 2010. We're now, you know, 6 years down the line.
Well, not long after Afro-modern we had Migrations, which I think, if I'm just thinking about shows that have happened here, so you had, if I look at the same year, you had the Chrysophilia retrospective, which had a completely different approach. Not only was it a solo show, so that involves a completely different way of working, but the technique in terms of captions and wall text was, in the show, the captions only stated the title, the materials and the date, and nothing else. And I spoke to the then curator of that show, Judith Nesbitt, and she explained that Chris didn't want anything next to his works to define it in any way, which I thought was a bold and good move in many ways. But then what was interesting is the critical responses to the show. With Afro-modern, the critical responses in the press married up quite closely with the messages that were coming through in the text. But in the Chrysophilia show, although in the space of the exhibition, very little was being said about his work, and Chris wanted all of us to just engage directly with the works. In the critical responses, you had suggestions about him being a naive artist, about him focusing on identity politics, even in the much later Trinidad works. So I'm quite interested in what happens when we try different curatorial techniques and how people respond to them, and whether it makes a difference to how people engage with the works. In this talk today, I'm interested in what that might tell us about an institutional attitude. But if the institution's attitude changes, or they try to, experiment with something else, and it makes no difference in the public sphere, then I don't know. Because then you also had Migrations, which I thought was also a really interesting approach, trying to frame migration beyond ethnic difference, or beyond blackness and whiteness and so on, and bringing the story of post-war migration to Britain into a much longer story of migration, and really trying to show how British art in itself and notions of Britishness were shaped through different moments in history and different artists coming to Britain. I thought that was a great idea, but actually, as we saw at the end, by doing things in quite a chronological way, a traditional art historical way, if you like, and having that post-war migration room right at the end, which happened to be all the black and brown artists all in one room, you get the same structure again. So I can see different things are being tried out, and I can only applaud that, and we just have to encourage people to keep doing that. And I think I really enjoyed the breakout sessions earlier, and hearing what all of you had to say about the importance of the captions and how they frame our understanding of the work, and what different techniques or what different strategies we might use to structure our understanding of the artworks on show. So I'm looking forward to hearing more about that in the plenary.
Angie, thank you. Now, I've only promised one thing this afternoon, and I just wonder whether the person who had their hand up, I'd love to go to, but I just wonder whether you could bring that question to the plenary, because I promised Courtney, because she has to be somewhere else, and I think we need to let her go. But what I really want to do is allow you all to get a cup of tea, but before you get the cup of tea, I want you to thank Courtney Martin and Anjalie, Dalal-Clayton and David Dibosa for a fantastic session this afternoon.